I didn't want a relationship with that God. Today, on this episode of Ascension with A Course in Miracles, the focus is going to be on the importance of cultivating a relationship with God. Not just any God, not the God of religion, but the God of love, the God of truth, the one true creator, source. It- Whatever you want to call it, I'm going to use the word God because, this has been a journey of leaving God to return to God for me. I had to leave the God of the church, the God of the Catholic Church, the God of punishment and sacrifice, the God that would demand the sacrifice of a newborn child, that would ask Abraham to sacrifice his firstborn son, a God that would turn people into pillars of salt. I didn't like that God. As a matter of fact, I wanted nothing to do with that God. That mean-spirited God reminded me a lot of my father, especially when my father was drunk. I didn't want a relationship with that God. However, inside of all of that, I felt an affinity with Jesus. I felt a connection to this loving, kind person who would protect people, who would protect the prostitute, who would let people know, hey, cast the first stone if you have no sins. If you've never made an error, or don't point at the speck in somebody else's eye if you haven't taken out the log out of your own eye. Jesus, for me, personified equality, treating everybody the same. Religion, for me, was about double standards. These people get this and the rest get that. And if you want to get this, you either have to pay or you have to sell your soul or something. And to me, that just never sat okay within my childlike beingness. Not childlike, I was a child. I would come home and I would listen to these Catholic sermons. Actually, let me be more accurate. I grew up in the Dominican Republic, so I never understood what they said in church because it was always in Latin, which I always found it so silly. These men wearing robes and these big, silly looking hats. It was like, what is this? I thought that this was like Halloween all the time. It was crazy to me. But I went to Catholic schools, and in the Catholic schools, they gave us instructions, they gave us lessons, and we reviewed passages and things like that. That's how I learned what little I learned about the Bible was from the nuns in my Catholic school. And it just made no sense. It absolutely made no sense. How can Jesus go around saying that God is a God of love, but yet we start reading the Old Testament and it's not a very loving God. It's a very mean God. Yes, there's some beautiful things in there. Some of the messages are absolutely so empowering, so really, if you take them to heart, you can find so much goodness in there. And I am by no means a Bible scholar. As a matter of fact, I know very little about the Bible, but bits and pieces that I have taken have given me an overall picture of what makes no sense, what is dualistic, and what is so loving, and absolutely what I want to follow. And fast forward to when I was in my 40s and experienced the greatest fear of my life, which was right after my mother died. I felt this terror that I was going to die just like my mother had, and I had dealt with death before. My dad had died a couple of years before my mom. My grandparents had passed away. I had friends. I had the children of friends who had passed away. Going to funerals and recognizing the grief that is experienced through death, that wasn't new to me. So when my mom passed, I knew I'm going to grieve. I was totally prepared for that. What I was not prepared for was the terror that I felt, because that is when my mortality became really clear. If my mom died, then I'm going to die too. And at that time, what came up for me was this fear of going to hell. And inside of that story, I recognized how scared I was of death because I had just the information that I had received from the Catholic Church. And after the Catholic Church, when I moved to the US, I went to a non-denominational holy roller churches, and that made me feel good in some ways because the music was really cool. But some of the stuff that I observed in the church, I didn't like one bit. Like, for example, there was a family there. I'll never forget this. I mean, this is 40 years ago, but I'll never forget this. There was a boy that, and I went to my junior years when I moved, or I was a junior in high school, and I went to the private school of the church. Harvest Temple was the name of that school. And there was a boy in my class, and I can't remember his first name, but the last name was Kennedy. And he was part of the family or the church family. There were three kids, but this boy was going through a really hard time. And I think mom had an illness and they fell on financial hard times. And I remember the church at the time was doing a fundraiser because the pastor needed a new car and he was going to get a new Cadillac. And everybody was donating money to get Vet Bellis a new Cadillac. And then all of a sudden, this family, the Kennedy family, is having a tough time and they're not going to be able to afford for this boy to continue to go to the private school. And when I heard what happened, I was so shocked. I wanted nothing to do with that church.